I previously summarized kind of the history of redlining and what it was when it was still in practice legally, and how that was kind of established by legislation and how it was brought on through history. But post the ending of redlining, it's not like the effects completely stopped right immediately when it became illegal, and neither did housing discrimination. It just took a lot of different forms. So that's what I'm going to get into with this section. Okay, so as previously stated, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 explicitly banned redlining and racially biased housing discrimination, but many private lenders and landlords continued to reject clients based on race with no fear of consequence, because obviously the law changing doesn't completely eradicate racial discrimination, especially when rules are not strongly enforced. The continued persistence of housing discrimination was correlated to the basic principles that the housing industry was built and continued to thrive on. Because once a profitable model that was built on redlining and systematic racism was established, it was hard to extinguish, hence the long-term endurance of housing discrimination and segregation. Now, how does this work in the long term? Well, housing is very often a lifelong asset passed down to your kids and then to their kids, etc. Or you can choose to sell your moderately nice house to buy a better one. But if you don't have the ability to own a house, or you live in a not necessarily great house that no one wants to purchase from you in an urban area, you aren't going to be able to pass down that generational wealth of a home. This contributes to continued disadvantage amongst people of color, where the effects of racial discrimination is passed down to their children, even if the original problem, which in this case would be redlining, is not necessarily as prevalent. The idea of ending housing discrimination is not really easy because of things like generational wealth and mobility. Once an area is constructed to cater towards a certain demographic of people, it is unlikely to rapidly change without a lot of outside force because people don't just up and move all the time. This is where urban communities, mainly full of minorities, start being targeted for urban development. During a time when infrastructure is starting to need to be developed, highways are a major priority for the US at this point. In order to build these highways, you have to obviously take up space in these already highly populated areas in order to promote transportation with cars. But the issue is that when you're trying to build highways in a highly populated area, you have to find room to do that. And unfortunately, the government, where they were deciding to put highways, decided to find the space in minority communities that were beginning to thrive even against everything that we were working against with redlining and continued disadvantage. For example, the city of Rondo, in St. Paul, when white suburbanites shifted from mass transit to automobiles and began calling for easy access to the Twin Cities and between their business corridors, running an expressway through the neighborhood of Rondo became the obvious option, as it conveniently sat between two cities' downtown cores. The city of Rondo was a largely Black population, and local historians estimate that more than 300 businesses were destroyed and more than 600 families lost their home, and some had little choice but to sell their property to the city at a fraction of its value, while those who resisted were forcibly removed. Thousands of residents were left to find a new place to live in a region where officials deliberately used redlining practices and racial housing covenants to restrict home sales to African Americans. Highway builders and downtown redevelopers had a common interest in eliminating low-income housing, and hence one redeveloper put it in 1959, free blighted areas for higher and better uses, which is a quote from Mole, pages 90 to 91. And as we've already seen, it was common for blighted and bad to just be a subtle way to say that minorities live there, and this redevelopment of urban areas was just a way to almost racially sanitize these larger cities, even though so much life and development was flourishing there. Housing discrimination in the 90s had evolved into an unseeable concern with predatory lending tactics because it was mostly hidden. It wasn't as out in the open. Reverse redlining, for example, is the practice of targeting redlined neighborhoods, which are risky, not as developed neighborhoods, for providing subprime mortgage loans to applicants. Since there was a higher risk of a default on the loan, the bank would charge a higher interest rate and make repayment hard for the home buyer. The homeowners would then be evicted for not being able to afford the higher amount. Predatory lending practices continued well into the 21st century and affected many low-income demographics, which we see this came to a head in 2008, where as introductory rates for home loans ended, evictions and foreclosures skyrocketed, and it actually was a large reason for the housing bubble and the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, which led to the financial recession. Often minorities and especially immigrants were the main targets of these predatory lending surrounding subprime mortgages because immigrants were less likely to understand the agreements as they were not necessarily in a language that they would understand, and minorities, having been historically unable to access proper housing and good housing in things like the suburbs, would be more likely to be looking for those deals that maybe they wouldn't have been able to access prior to this. So it's basically just a reversal, but still the same, taking advantage and exploiting minorities.